In this lesson, we'll learn how we can construct advanced shapes using compound paths. Okay, so in the last lesson, we were playing with Illustrator's Pathfinder panel and learning about creating advanced shapes with it. And we ended up creating something called a compound path at the end of that lesson. Well, let's go ahead and just take a look at what a compound path is. Let me just go ahead and zoom in here on this. And remember, we punched this triangle through this circle in the previous lesson. Now, a really simple explanation for what a compound path is an easy way of creating a knocked out portion of a shape. Now, let me just go ahead and just release this compound path. Now, we can actually release a compound path just by coming up here to Object and choosing Compound Path and then Release. And what we're left with here is our original two shapes. Now notice they all take on the same color. So let's go ahead and just recreate this compound path just for a moment. Let's come in and give that triangle its own color. Let's maybe give it that same tan color here. Alright. Now in the previous lesson we used the -front command to actually make the compound path. But if we were actually intending on creating a compound path, let's just go ahead and pull that back in front. We could actually come up here to the Object drop down, choose Compound Path and Make. Keyboard shortcut for that is Control-8. So it's a pretty handy keyboard shortcut to remember. Let me just go ahead and use that here. Now, we can actually make changes to this compound path. This is not a permanent change. Let me go ahead and just double click on this and enter into isolation mode for this object. Remember, we talked about isolation mode when we were learning about groups, and we can actually enter isolation mode also by coming up to this little button in our control panel. Let's go ahead and go into isolation mode, and notice that now we've got our layer that we're currently on. And we've also got the word compound path here instead of group. Now, once we're inside this compound path, we can actually grab either one of these two shapes and move it around and adjust this compound path. So you can see here how the shapes are sort of adjusting as I move the circle around here. The compound path and the portion that's knocked out is limiting itself to only the areas where the two shapes overlap. Now, it's important to remember that sort of the key object in a compound path is going to be the backmost object. So because the circle was behind the triangle, both of them are taking on the appearance attributes of the circle, being the stroke color, the fill color, and any effects that the circle had. Now, the circle only had a blue fill on it, so that's the only appearance attribute that's being populated over to the triangle. So a compound path is really kind of a special type of group. Now, we can't actually ungroup a compound path. We actually have to release it like I just showed you. Let me just go ahead and exit out of isolation mode here. And let's take a look at what this compound path looks like in our Layers panel. If we select that object, come over here, and you can see that we have the compound path selected here because there's a blue square next to it. So a compound path actually appears in the Layers panel as just that. So we have paths, groups, and now we have compound paths in our Layers panel. Now, I tell you what, let's go ahead and look at what a compound path looks like on multiple objects. So we've got these three squares, or these three rectangles that we were experimenting with in the previous lesson. Let's go ahead and create a compound path using all three of these shapes. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my Control-8 keyboard shortcut here, and notice that the result looks kind of familiar. As a matter of fact, in the previous lesson, when we used the exclude function under shape modes in our Pathfinder, it left us with a similar result. Let me go ahead and just undo that compound path, and let's go ahead and exclude that. Now notice here that the exclude function is applying the frontmost object's color to all the other objects. And remember, we had the odd and the even rule, where the even numbered objects overlap, it's knocking that area out, and where the odd number of objects overlap, it's actually leaving that alone. The compound path works sort of similar to this. Let me go ahead and just undo this and apply a compound path again. Now notice that with the exception of the color change, remember our backmost object being green, so that color has been applied to the rest of the shapes here. Really, the only difference is this little portion of the compound path right here. In the exclude result, this was knocked out, but in the compound path, it's not. That's because of the compound path really functions centered around that backmost object. So where two objects overlap, the backmost object, the area is going to be knocked out. So we see that area knocked out here, and we see that area knocked out here. But these two shapes right here were overlapping right here, but because the backmost object wasn't involved there, it's disregarded. But you can see here where all three shapes overlap, it's again leaving this area alone. So really it works similar to the exclude command under shape modes, but a little bit different. If you also remember, the exclude function was a permanent change, whereas with a compound path we can actually go into isolation mode and we can move these shapes around and adjust the end result. So compound path works a little bit differently than the exclude function. Now, I've got here one of the letters from our logo that I've gone ahead and pulled down because I want to show you a really common type of compound path. Now, I'm not sure if you have played with this logo much in our project files yet, but if you have, you'll notice here that this is not text that we can actually modify. These are actually shapes, and we'll get into that more when we talk about the text abilities in Illustrator, but I want to go ahead and show you that if we select this B, it is a compound path. Now, when you actually convert text into shapes, a lot of times those letter forms have counters. Like in this B, you have a counter here and a counter here. Well, Illustrator is smart enough to know that these areas would translate into compound paths if this was a shape and not text. I tell you what, let me go ahead and release this compound path and let's see what the result is. So I'll come up here and go Object, Compound Path, and let's choose Release. Alright, now we've got sort of an interesting result here. Let me just zoom in on that, and I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and grab the main portion of this B and pull it to the right. Now you can see here we've got all these smaller shapes that are left over. So there was actually a compound path here with multiple objects being knocked out of our B as a result of that letter form being converted into a shape. Now, I know that when I'm talking to new Illustrator users who are having to work with, say, somebody else's artwork, one of the first questions they ask me is, what is a compound path? How do you work with those? So, you know, compound paths are something that may take a little bit of getting used to, but it may be of benefit to you to actually think about ways that you might incorporate these into your own work. Remember, we're creating a knocked out area, so we can actually see through that area. So in between lessons, think about some ways that you might be able to integrate compound paths into your own work. When you come back, we're going to talk about something called a compound shape.